South Korea's successful space launch last week is followed by a similar attempt by North Korea on this Wednesday that reportedly ends in failure and a pledge for another attempt in the near future. So what is the latest regarding North Korea's most recent violation of UN resolutions? What has been the foreign media response to South Korea's successful space launch? And what is the fate of the Korean man who opened the door of the plane mid-air? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we bring you our weekly check on stories here that made headlines elsewhere as well. For more on this, I have Thomas Maresca here in the studio with me. Thomas, it's good to have you back.
Thanks, as always.
I also have Malene Jensen with us. Malene, welcome back.
Thank you.
Right, Thomas, let's start with you then. North Korea's space launch, attempt to launch into space its satellite was a failure today. It was covered by the foreign media as well. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I think, at the very start, the first sort of headline that a lot of foreign media jumped on was the fact that there was an emergency evacuation notice that was sent out in Seoul, which I've never experienced. I think most of the people that have lived here a while have never had that experience. So that was kind of a twist on these launches have become in some ways background noise. There's been so many of them, so that for a few moments was kind of
unsettling.
Unsettling and sort of cast it in a more urgent light, perhaps. So there was a little bit about that factor initially, and then of course afterwards it was just sort of following up on what was launched. What do we know about it? And North Korea had already announced that it planned to launch a military reconnaissance satellite. They announced earlier this week, so this was obviously that attempt, and as we've been following along, it failed. North Korea even admitted that it failed, and it splashed down in the Yellow Sea. One interesting factor is, I guess, the South Korean military has salvaged some pieces from this, so this might be a little bit of a sign as to where is North Korea's technology as regards this, because there have been a lot of questions. Is North Korea capable of putting a satellite into orbit? Do they have the kind of reconnaissance technology that they've been talking about? So this, may or may not be a clue to that. I think it's sort of, again, now at a wait and see moment. North Korea has already said they plan to launch again. So, that's sort of where we are.
Right, a second attempt in the near future. Malene, staying here on the Korean Peninsula, South Korea's space launch, Nuri's third launch into space, was a success. It was covered, of course, last week. I understand it was also covered by the foreign media. Could you tell us a bit about that?
Yes. So the foreign media regarded this space launch as rather a success. Several media dubbed it as, called it a breakthrough in Korea's attempt to make a space race in Asia. It was definitely seen as a great success, and I think especially in the recent light with North Korea, with that issue of their failed launch, it will be seen as an even greater success that South Korea actually managed to get a satellite into orbit. It's also been a success compared to, for example, Europe, where a Danish astronaut just last week was calling for Europe to be more aware of their space technology and actually getting more into the game, along with, for example, South Korea or the United States. Previously, Europe has mainly had a space success in regard to Russia during the Cold War. But now it seems like Europe is not really trying that hard, especially compared to, for example, both of the two Koreas.
Is there a lot of, would you say, public support for space exploration in Denmark? Keeping in mind the comments by this Danish astronaut who said that Europe is falling behind with regard to the race to space.
Well, no, I wouldn't say so, actually. If you look at the bigger if you look at how many people, for example, in the United States who are interested in space technology and who are supporting making more, sending more things into space and making more rockets and stuff like that, I would say that the Danish people are not against space technology, but Denmark is a very small country, and space equipment and space research is very, very expensive, and I think it requires a bigger economy than we can muster in Denmark to even reach the knees of countries like South Korea or the United States.
Right, I see. Thomas, also in the air, but on a more alarming note, there was a story about a man who opened the door of a plane in mid-air. This was covered quite a bit here on the local front, of course, as well as abroad. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yes, well, I think, airplane incidents often get a lot of coverage internationally, and certainly the videos that emerged from the cabin itself were just so compelling, first on social media, and then it was definitely picked up all over the world. I mean, it was shocking and sort of terrifying to see, and I think everybody has a visceral reaction to seeing something like that. The follow-up has been just sort of what we're hearing from the police reporting to local media. I mean, the suspect was a 33-year-old man that was arrested, and police have said that he was undergoing some kind of psychological or mental issues at the time, and I think told them that he had just lost his job and said that he was feeling suffocated and wanted to get out the door. And this was as the plane was on its approach. It was like, a little more than 200 meters in the air approaching Daegu. Authorities have said, though, that it would be impossible to open the door at a higher altitude. The pressure would be much higher. So, it was at a relatively low altitude, and, no one was injured. About a dozen people were taken to the hospital. And so the suspect is potentially can see up to 10 years in prison for violating, there's an aviation security law. And, in response, Asiana and I think a couple other airlines have jumped on as well, have stopped selling those seats that are right next to the emergency exit on certain planes, like the one this guy was on was an Airbus A321, which, I think is just a little bit of a maybe reassurance kind of gesture to passengers for the near term. I mean, there's no real sense of how long that will last. But yeah, so it was certainly a widely covered story, though, around the world.
Right, it really was, it really was. Meanwhile, Malene, here in South Korea, again, the Disaster Control Center, it held its last meeting with regard to COVID-19, as tomorrow, that is the start of June, the country Korea lowers its alert level for COVID-19. Now, this was the center's 691st meeting ever since the start of the pandemic, of course. All that being said, Malene, what marks would you grant South Korea for its management of the pandemic?
Well, I think Korea's worldwide legacy will still be how well Korea managed the pandemic, especially in the beginning when COVID broke out. Korea really was seen as this role model country, and I think almost no matter what happens, Korea will never be forgotten for that. Especially, I know in Europe, Korea is really remembered as this kind of model country in controlling the pandemic. However, I also know that there have been quite a few more critical articles during the end of the pandemic in 2021, 2022, criticizing Korea for being a bit too precautious, taking a bit too long in, for example, removing the regulations regarding masks, or removing the regulations regarding not being able to go out at night and those kind of things. But despite that, if you look at how well Korea managed to get out of the pandemic, in contrast to, for example, United States, Italy, India, Korea will definitely be a success story in regard to the COVID pandemic.
Right, and hopefully we won't have another pandemic in the near future. Moving forward, Malene, the BBC, it featured an extensive piece on Korea trying to coax its young recluses to venture outdoors. Do tell us more about that.
Yes, so in South Korea, there is approximately 340,000 young Koreans who refuse to leave their home. And these types of people are being called hikikomori, which is a Japanese term for people being afraid of going out. This number has been on the rise ever since COVID, and it is unfortunately a trend we see worldwide. We see it in Japan, we see it in Korea, we also see it in Denmark, for example, in Europe, in the United States. But it seems to be especially severe in East Asia. And Korea's response in trying to get these young people to leave their home have been giving them more money, giving them this kind of state monthly supplement. However, people actually working with the hikikomori, they are saying that they are not really sure that money is the right way to make young people leave their homes, because it is rarely financial issues that keep people indoor. It is the pressure of being in society, the pressure of conforming into specific types of jobs, of education, of going into this everyday treadmill, you could say, that makes many young people afraid that they cannot find and get the same success as, for example, their classmates, their co-workers. And this fright is what is keeping them indoor. So money will probably not give them enough help to actually give them the courage to go out.
Right, and staying with that, Thomas, how do you explain the prevalence of this unfortunate reality, which Malene has pointed out is not purely a Korean phenomenon?
No, not at all. As she said, the term for it is hikikomori, which originated in Japan in the 90s, and it's been a phenomenon there. And I think it's some of the shared social conditions that Japan and South Korea have that is seen as driving it, perhaps its greater prevalence here. Again, as Malene mentioned, there's an incredible amount of pressure in, just from the school environment onwards. I think a lot of us have covered the, annual sunung, entrance exams, and I think there's that feeling of, you have to get on a track at a certain point and stay on it, or you'll be lost. And so a lot of young people are responding to that feeling of just intense pressure, intense competition, which I think is also magnified by the realization that, perhaps the explosive economic growth that previous generations could at least look towards as saying, okay, this is, making all of this endless work, there's a end in sight. I think a lot of younger people are clearly seeing that their job prospects don't necessarily look as hopeful. There's been youth unemployment or underemployment issues for a long time. We're seeing that reflected in the low birth rates in South Korea, high rental prices. There's a whole sort of menu of social conditions that are exacerbating this. And another thing that people have pointed to, which also Japan shares, is a culture of bullying in high schools. Which has emerged globally with the Glory, this Netflix series, and it's Kpop, I guess it's called. And there's almost a Me Too movement of that happening in South Korea, about people reflecting on that. But and it's also more East Asia wide. It does seem China shares some of these same conditions as well. There's a phenomenon they call lying flat there, which is not necessarily, some of it I think is recluse behavior, some of it is just people kind of giving up a bit of not trying as hard, not getting into this real sense of the rat race for the same basic conditions. And yeah, it does extend to other countries as well. Certainly there are these types of recluses in the U.S. And there's also, these more subtle phenomenons that share some of the same characteristics. There's a term that was called quiet quitting in the U.S. that kind of emerged during the pandemic. I think that also shined a light on some of these issues that, made people start to question their work-life balance, where it's not necessarily people not leaving their homes, but just kind of realizing I don't want to give all of my time, all of my energy to a job that doesn't necessarily, have my interests in mind. So there's, that global shift is happening in a lot of cases, but I think Korea is seeing maybe the most intense, factors coming together to really, make it a significant issue at this moment.
Right, unfortunately, of course. On a light note then, Malene, aside from the 7 Korean productions that were invited to screen at the Cannes International Film Festival this year, I believe a K-pop group made history there. Tell us about that, please.
Yes, it is a K-pop girl group aespa who made their first appearance on the Cannes Festival, and it is the first time that a K-pop group, where all the group members are on the red carpet at the same time in the Cannes Film Festival. So it has been seen as some kind of K-pop success story, and a lot of aespa's fans have been really, really happy to see them there. And They have received so much support, and it has been seen as a great success for the group, and aespa is already known to be a K-pop success group. The reason that they were attending the film festival is because they're doing a collaboration with the Swiss jeweler Chopin, and that jeweler had invited them to be on the red carpet.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Thomas, on a more somber note then, Bloomberg, it claims that Korea will not cash in on Beijing's ban on US chipmaker Micron. Could you tell us about that particular report and its broader implications, of course?
Right. Well, I think the situation in general highlights where South Korea is, and kind of being caught in the middle of this great global competition, tech competition between China and the U.S. The U.S. last year put export controls on advanced semiconductors and equipment to manufacture them, towards China, and I think China's Micron ban is clearly seen as a response to that. For South Korea, obviously it would represent an opportunity to fill this gap, especially the Micron materials that are being banned are memory chips, which South Korea is a global powerhouse in, with Samsung and SK Hynix, that would seem to be an obvious market opportunity for them to fill the gap. This Bloomberg report, I mean, this is nothing that South Korea has officially announced. This was kind of a on background type of report that said that South Korea has decided not to pursue this opportunity. I mean, there have been other reports that have said different things, so it's not exactly clear what South Korea is going to do. But you can see the dilemma for them. On the one hand, obviously China is still the biggest market for the export of these semiconductors, which is a huge segment in the South Korean economy. At the same time, South Korea and the U.S. have a lot of aligned interests and are kind of moving closer and closer in many areas, of course, in security and military and other regions. So I think the idea would be that South Korea is maybe looking longer term as far as this particular issue is concerned, and saying, okay, we're going to prioritize a longer term relationship with the U.S. over this one issue. The question is, China also has the capacity to respond economically. They can certainly use a lot of levers to exert pressure on South Korea in reverse. So I think it's we still haven't heard anything concrete, but it's a real almost encapsulates the situation that South Korea finds itself in.
Right, and I suppose time will tell us then. Malene, on the security front, a recent ranking had the South Korean military in 6th place for most powerful for this year, that is. Could you tell us a bit more about Korea's ranking and that of other countries as well?
Yes, so the ranking factors are the amount of military equipment and troops, the financial standing, and the available resources. And Korea was the #1 East Asian country, which can be seen as quite a big accomplishment, right after China, of course. China is #2, but Korea is #6, which is a very, very good position for Korea, taking in consideration that it is not that big of a country compared to other East Asian countries. So Korea was ranking so high due to its aircraft fleet, due to its fighting vehicles, and due to its helicopters. And the highest ranked military power was the United States. #2 was Russia. #3 was China. #4 was India. And #5 was UK. So it is like a really high position that South Korea has. And of course, it has something to do with military service in Korea, that all able-bodied men have to serve in the military. It's also interesting to see that Korea came way before Japan, which was ranked as #8, even though Japan has said that it will take up the amount of money that it will spend on military activities.
Right, of course. Thomas, staying with security, South Korean troops and their US counterparts, they've held a large live fire drills near the border with North Korea. This was last week. Now, some pundits claim that such joint military activities, which have been going on under the Yoon administration, may be keeping North Korea from taking on more brazen acts of provocation, if I may. What do you care to add to this?
Well, I think as we saw this morning, North Korea is certainly continuing its provocative acts. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that North Korea has specific goals that it's looking to hit in terms of its nuclear and missile capabilities. That it is just really, Pyongyang is fixated on, I think, attaining these certain levels that would demonstrate its deterrence capabilities, its ability to pose a legitimate threat to South Korea and to the United States, and sort of start, put itself on that level if it's going to, ever return to any sort of negotiations. At the same time, we don't know what they haven't done because of perhaps these shows of force that the U.S. and South Korea have demonstrated. I mean, there are some arguments that perhaps keeping up this level of just intensity in terms of drills does put pressure on North Korea to try to respond and accelerate its programs, while at the same time they're suffering economically. There's food shortages, harvest season is coming up, so will that force them to kind of, perhaps take a step back from their defense expenditures? I mean, there's just a lot of things we don't know about it. I attended that live fire drill, and I think some of it too was just intended as a show to the domestic audience. Certainly the way it was presented there, it was kind of a show. There was music, there were videos, there was a large audience. Some of them were soldiers and parents of soldiers. And I think, it probably riles up and builds up morale for the troops themselves. Is sending a message to the South Korean public, I think, that, we're taking this seriously, we're taking your defense seriously. And if you talk to, military personnel themselves, they do value these joint exercises a lot. I mean, they like to train, and especially in terms of coordinating between U.S. forces and South Korean forces. I don't think anyone would say it's a waste of time, on the sort of fundamental level.
Right, especially keeping in mind North Korea's continued provocations, of course. Right, well, on that note, we'll have to end it there. Thomas, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thanks so much.
And Malene, thank you very much for your insight today. Right, well, that is all for this session of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow. That is Thursday, so do join us then.